My parents favored my sister my whole life. Then she found out I had $15 million and had a full-blown meltdown at Thanksgiving dinner. Dad couldn't speak. I never thought I'd be writing this story, but after what happened at Thanksgiving dinner 3 weeks ago, I need to get this off my chest. My name is Sarah, I'm 35, and I've spent most of my life being the invisible daughter in a family that worshipped my younger sister Madison. Growing up in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, the favoritism was so blatant it was almost cartoonish. Madison was born when I was 5, and from that moment forward, I became background noise in my own home. She was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was the disappointment who never quite measured up to their expectations. My parents, Robert and Linda, made it clear from early on that Madison was special. She got the bigger bedroom with the walk-in closet while I stayed in what was essentially a converted storage room. When Madison wanted piano lessons, they bought her a brand new baby grand that dominated our living room. When I asked for guitar lessons, I was told we couldn't afford it and handed a used acoustic from a garage sale. The pattern continued through high school. Madison was a cheerleader and homecoming queen, dating the star quarterback while my parents attended every single one of her events with professional cameras and matching t-shirts with her name on them. Meanwhile, I was captain of the debate team and made it to state championships twice, but my parents never showed up to a single competition. They said debates were boring and not real accomplishments like Madison's. College was where the financial favoritism became most obvious. My parents paid for Madison's entire education at Northwestern University, bought her a brand new Honda Civic, and gave her a $2,000 monthly allowance for expenses. I had to take out student loans to attend Ohio State, worked 3 part-time jobs, and lived on ramen noodles for 4 years. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science, my parents attended Madison's sorority formal the same weekend instead of my graduation ceremony. After college, I moved to San Francisco to work for a tech startup called Virtual Sphere. It was 2015, and the company was developing breakthrough haptic feedback technology that would revolutionize how people interacted with virtual environments. While VR gaming existed, our innovation was creating realistic touch sensations that made virtual experiences feel genuinely physical. I was employee number 12, working 16-hour days for below-market salary in exchange for equity in the company. Meanwhile, Madison moved back home after graduating with a communications degree and no clear career path. My parents bought her a condo in downtown Cleveland and supported her through various creative pursuits that never lasted more than 6 months. She tried being a lifestyle blogger, a personal shopper, a yoga instructor, and a jewelry designer. Each failed venture was met with encouragement and more financial support from our parents. During this time, I rarely spoke to my family. I call on birthdays and holidays, but conversations were brief and focused entirely on Madison's latest projects. My parents never asked about my work or my life in California. I was the distant daughter who had abandoned the family by moving across the country. In 2019, everything changed. Virtual Sphere was acquired by a major tech conglomerate for $2.3 billion. As one of the early employees with significant equity, my share of the acquisition was worth $15.2 million after taxes. Suddenly, at age 30, I was financially independent for life. The day the acquisition closed, I sat in my tiny studio apartment in San Francisco's Mission District, staring at my laptop screen and the wire transfer confirmation that had just arrived. $15.2 million. The number seemed surreal, like a typo or some kind of elaborate joke. I'd been surviving on ramen noodles and generic cereal for so long that I had to read the email 3 times before it sank in. My first instinct was to call someone, to share this life-changing moment with family. I actually picked up my phone and started dialing my parents' house before I stopped myself. What would I say? Hey Mom, remember how you said my computer stuff would never amount to anything? Well, I just became a multimillionaire. I could already picture the conversation. They'd either not believe me, or worse, they'd immediately start calculating how this windfall could benefit Madison's latest venture. Instead, I called my best friend from college, Jessica, who was working as a nurse in Seattle. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, then insisted on flying down the next weekend to celebrate properly. Jessica had been my roommate during those brutal student loan years, surviving alongside me on cheap pasta and dollar store shampoo. She understood what this meant in a way my family never would. The first few months after the acquisition were surreal. I gave my 2 weeks' notice at Virtual Sphere, much to my boss's confusion since I'd been one of their most dedicated employees. I told him I wanted to start consulting independently, which was true, just not the whole truth. I wasn't ready to announce my windfall to anyone beyond Jessica and my financial advisor. Buying the house in Marin County was my first real splurge. After years of cramped studio apartments and shared bathrooms, I wanted space and privacy. The house sat on 2 acres with panoramic views of the San Francisco Bay, featuring 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and a home office with floor-to-ceiling windows. The asking price was $3.8 million, which would have been impossible just months earlier. Walking through those rooms for the first time as the owner, I felt like I was living someone else's life. The irony wasn't lost on me that this house was bigger than the suburban home I'd grown up in, where Madison had claimed the master bedroom at age 16 while I stayed in what was essentially a converted closet. Now I had bedrooms I wasn't even using, just because I could. I started my consulting firm, Tech Strategy Solutions, more as a passion project than a necessity. I genuinely enjoyed helping startups navigate the complex world of technology development and business strategy. My experience at Virtual Sphere had taught me valuable lessons about scaling companies and managing rapid growth. Within 6 months, I had more clients than I could handle, all paying premium rates for my expertise. The business success was satisfying, but it also created an interesting problem. I was making money faster than I could reasonably spend it, even with my new lifestyle. My investment advisor, a sharp woman named Patricia who specialized in managing sudden wealth, helped me diversify my portfolio and plan for long-term financial security. By 2021, my net worth had grown to just over $18 million. By 2023, smart investments and my successful consulting practice had pushed my total assets to over $22 million. During this time, my family's financial situation was deteriorating. Through occasional social media posts and brief phone calls, I learned that Madison's marriage to Derek was falling apart spectacularly. She'd convinced him to invest his inheritance in her jewelry-making business, which collapsed within 8 months when she got bored and decided she wanted to be a life coach instead. Derek filed for divorce and demanded half the condo my parents had bought for Madison, since it was in both their names. The divorce proceedings were messy and expensive. My parents hired an attorney to protect Madison's interests, draining several $1,000s from their retirement savings. Madison moved back home temporarily, then into a smaller rental apartment when living with our parents became too stressful for her creative energy. Meanwhile, Robert was facing his own challenges. The manufacturing company he'd worked for since college was downsizing, and at age 62, he was offered an early retirement package that was less generous than expected. Linda had never worked outside the home, having dedicated herself to raising Madison and managing the household. Their financial cushion, never substantial to begin with, was rapidly disappearing. I learned about their struggles through Christmas cards and brief phone conversations where Linda would mention their temporary setbacks and how proud they were of Madison for staying positive during her transition period. The subtext was always that I should be more supportive, more involved, more like the loving daughter Madison pretended to be when she needed something. The few times I visited during these years, the dynamic never changed. Madison remained the center of attention, regaling everyone with stories about her latest business ideas or dating adventures. I was still the daughter who lived so far away and was too busy with work to really be part of the family. When I mentioned buying my house or expanding my consulting practice, the responses were polite but disinterested. Madison's announcement that she was thinking about starting a food truck, however, prompted an hour-long discussion about locations and investment opportunities. In early 2021, I decided to buy the vineyard in Napa Valley, more as a tax shelter than anything else. The property came with a charming cottage that I used as a weekend retreat, and I hired a local vintner to manage the actual wine production. It was a peaceful escape from the hustle of San Francisco, and I often brought dates there for romantic weekends away from the city. That summer, I met David at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was a pediatric surgeon at UCSF, recently divorced, with a dry sense of humor and absolutely no interest in technology or startups. When he asked what I did for work, I told him I was a consultant, which was technically true. He seemed impressed that I owned my own business but didn't press for details about my financial situation. We started dating casually, then more seriously as the months went by. David was the first person I dated who knew me before knowing about my wealth, and I was terrified of how he'd react when he inevitably found out. His commute from Marin County to UCSF via the Golden Gate Bridge was manageable, and he loved the peaceful environment after long shifts at the hospital. The revelation came naturally about 6 months into our relationship. We were planning a weekend trip to Hawaii, and I casually mentioned we could stay at the Four Seasons if he wanted. When he joked about not being able to afford that level of luxury, I realized it was time to tell him the truth. His reaction was everything I'd hoped for. After the initial shock wore off, he was genuinely happy for me and impressed by how I'd handled my sudden wealth. He appreciated that I lived modestly despite my means and that I'd built a successful consulting practice because I enjoyed the work, not because I needed the money. Most importantly, he understood why I've been cautious about revealing my financial situation too early in our relationship. "You know what this means, right?" he said as we walked along Baker Beach the evening I told him. "That you're going to start expecting expensive gifts?" I joked. "No," he laughed. "It means I'll never have to worry about you dating me for my money." By late 2022, David and I were discussing moving in together. He loved my house in Marin County and was happy to make the longer commute to the hospital. We were talking about marriage, maybe starting a family, building a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than financial dependency or family obligation. During this period of personal happiness, my family's situation continued to worsen. Madison's catering business was struggling to find its footing. She'd invested heavily in professional equipment and a small commercial kitchen space, funded largely by another loan from our parents and maxing out personal credit cards since no bank would approve her for business credit given her track record. The problem was that Madison had no real experience in food service and no understanding of the razor-thin profit margins in the catering industry. Her business model seemed to be based entirely on social media aesthetics. She focused on creating Instagram-worthy presentations rather than developing reliable systems for food preparation, delivery, or customer service. Her prices were too high for casual events but not sophisticated enough for high-end clients. Within a year, she was behind on rent for the kitchen space and falling deeper into debt. The stress was taking a toll on my parents' marriage. Robert, now fully retired on a smaller pension than expected, spent his days watching television and occasionally helping with odd jobs around the neighborhood. Linda had taken a part-time position at a local boutique, her first job in over 30 years, to help cover their monthly expenses. They were both in their mid-60s, an age when they should have been enjoying retirement, not worrying about making rent and supporting their adult daughter's failing business ventures. Through social media, I could see the strain in their family photos. Robert looked tired and older than his years, while Linda's smile seemed forced. Madison, however, still posted regularly about her entrepreneurial journey and building something amazing, apparently oblivious to the financial burden she was placing on our aging parents. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Here I was, living in a multi-million-dollar house with money I couldn't spend fast enough, watching my family struggle with basic financial security. The ethical questions kept me awake at night. Did I have an obligation to help them, despite their decades of emotional neglect? Was I being petty by withholding support, or was I finally setting healthy boundaries? Jessica, who had become my closest confidant about the family situation, was firmly in the not your problem camp. She reminded me regularly of how my parents had treated me throughout my life, how they'd prioritized Madison's comfort over my basic needs, how they'd missed my major life milestones while celebrating Madison's minor achievements. "You don't owe them anything," she said during one of our regular video calls. "They made their choices for 30 years. You're not responsible for fixing the consequences now." My therapist, Dr. Reynolds, whom I'd started seeing in 2021 to work through some of the childhood trauma and family dysfunction, was more nuanced in her approach. She helped me understand that my desire to help was natural and showed my capacity for compassion, but she also emphasized the importance of protecting my own mental health and not enabling destructive patterns. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved," she said during one particularly difficult session. "And you can't buy love or respect from people who've never valued you for who you are." The turning point in my thinking came during Christmas 2022. I'd flown home for a brief visit, bringing expensive gifts for everyone as usual. I gave my parents a week-long cruise voucher and Madison a professional photography session for her catering business. The gifts were received politely but without real enthusiasm, and within hours, the conversation had returned to Madison's financial struggles and how unfair it was that banks didn't understand her creative vision. Sitting in my childhood bedroom, which had been converted into Linda's craft room years earlier, I realized that no amount of money would ever change the fundamental dynamic of our relationship. I would always be the afterthought daughter, the one they turned to for practical support while reserving their emotional investment for Madison. That night, I made a decision. I would continue to maintain minimal contact with my family, but I wouldn't offer financial assistance unless specifically asked. And if I was asked, I would evaluate the request based on whether it would actually help or just enable more destructive behavior. The months leading up to Thanksgiving 2023 were particularly challenging for my family. Madison's catering business had finally collapsed completely, leaving her with over $40,000 in debt and no clear path forward. She was now 30 years old, living back with our parents, and facing the reality that none of her business ventures had ever succeeded. Robert's health had started declining due to stress and untreated diabetes, requiring regular doctor visits and expensive medications. Linda was working longer hours at the boutique but still couldn't cover all their expenses. They were falling behind on their mortgage payments and had started using credit cards for basic necessities. Through all of this, I maintained my usual level of contact, birthday cards, brief holiday phone calls, and the annual Thanksgiving invitation that I usually declined. This year, however, something made me decide to attend. Maybe it was curiosity about whether their financial stress had changed their perspective on family priorities. Maybe it was guilt about having so much while they struggled. Or maybe it was just time to finally confront the elephant in the room. The money changed my life in ways I never expected. I traveled the world, took cooking classes in France, learned to scuba dive in Thailand, and spent 3 weeks exploring New Zealand's South Island. I learned to play the guitar I'd always wanted as a child, taking private lessons from a former member of a Grammy-winning band who taught out of his studio in Berkeley. I bought season tickets to the San Francisco Symphony and the opera, cultural experiences that had always seemed impossibly expensive before. More importantly, the financial security gave me the confidence to pursue relationships and friendships without the undercurrent of economic anxiety that had defined my 20s. I joined a hiking club in Marin County, volunteered at a local literacy program, and even started dating again after years of being too exhausted from work to maintain a social life. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the material changes. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't constantly worried about money. I wasn't checking my bank account balance before every grocery trip or calculating whether I could afford to replace my worn-out shoes. The chronic low-level stress that had been my constant companion since college finally began to fade. But with this new freedom came unexpected challenges. I found myself questioning every relationship, wondering whether people were genuinely interested in me or secretly calculating my net worth. I became hyper-aware of how I dressed, where I shopped, what car I drove, trying to strike a balance between enjoying my wealth and not broadcasting it to the world. The isolation was the hardest part. I couldn't complain about my problems to anyone without sounding ungrateful or privileged. Who wants to hear about the emotional complexity of sudden wealth when they're struggling to pay rent? Jessica was supportive, but even she sometimes made jokes about my rich people problems that stung more than she realized. This emotional complexity became particularly acute whenever I thought about my family. Part of me wanted to share my success with them, to finally have something that would make them proud of me. But a larger part of me knew that revealing my wealth would fundamentally change our dynamic in ways that couldn't be undone. They'd never treated me as an equal before. Would sudden financial superiority really improve our relationship, or would it just create new forms of resentment and manipulation? I decided to maintain the status quo, at least for now. During our infrequent phone conversations, I continued to describe my life in vague terms. I was doing well with my consulting business, staying busy with various projects, getting by in expensive San Francisco. It wasn't exactly lying, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The deception became more complicated as my lifestyle naturally upgraded. When Linda asked about my living situation, I mentioned I'd moved to a nicer place without specifying that it was a 4-bedroom house on 2 acres with a wine cellar and infinity pool. When Robert inquired about my work, I said the consulting was picking up without mentioning that I was charging $500 an hour and turning away clients. Meanwhile, Madison's life was becoming increasingly chaotic. Her marriage to Derek had started showing cracks within the first year. He was a decent guy from a middle-class family who worked in accounting for a small firm. He'd been attracted to Madison's energy and beauty, but he was unprepared for her expensive tastes and complete lack of financial responsibility. The tension came to a head when Madison convinced Derek to cash out his 401k to invest in her jewelry-making business. She'd become obsessed with creating artisanal pieces for the modern woman, despite having no formal training in metalworking or business management. The $18,000 Derek provided went toward a professional workbench, high-end tools, and what Madison called startup inventory but what looked more like an expensive shopping spree at craft stores. The business lasted exactly 4 months. Madison quickly discovered that jewelry making was tedious, detailed work that required patience and precision, qualities she'd never developed. Her pieces were amateur quality but priced at boutique levels. She managed to sell a few items to family friends who were being polite, but legitimate customers were non-existent. When Derek suggested she might need more training or perhaps a different business model, Madison accused him of not believing in her vision. When he pointed out that they'd spent his retirement savings on equipment that was now gathering dust in their spare bedroom, plus faced significant tax penalties for the early 401k withdrawal, she accused him of being controlling and unsupportive. The fights escalated from there. Meanwhile, Madison's life was becoming increasingly chaotic. She'd married her college boyfriend Derek in an extravagant wedding that my parents spent $80,000 on, but the marriage fell apart within 2 years. She moved back into her condo and continued jumping between career ideas with no success. My parents were now in their 60s and starting to worry about their retirement savings, which had been severely depleted by decades of supporting Madison's lifestyle. This brings us to 3 weeks ago. Despite our strained relationship, I still received the annual Thanksgiving invitation. I almost didn't go, but something made me decide to attend. Maybe it was curiosity about whether anything had changed, or maybe I just missed having a family, even a dysfunctional one. I flew into Cleveland on Wednesday night and drove my rental car to my parents' house on Thursday morning. The familiar suburban street looked exactly the same, with its neat lawns and matching mailboxes. Walking up to the front door, I felt that old familiar knot in my stomach that always accompanied family visits. Linda answered the door with her usual lukewarm greeting. "Oh, Sarah. You made it. Madison's been here since Tuesday helping me prepare everything. Of course she had. I stepped inside to find Madison in the kitchen, wearing an apron and acting like the dutiful daughter she'd always been in their eyes. Sarah. Look at you, still so skinny. Are you eating enough? Madison gave me a patronizing hug while looking me up and down. I was wearing a simple black dress from Nordstrom, nothing flashy, but I felt her examining me for signs of success or failure. Robert emerged from the living room carrying a beer and gave me a brief pat on the shoulder. How's the computer stuff going? Still doing that programming thing? He'd never bothered to understand what I actually did for work, and apparently 4 years of me trying to explain it hadn't registered. I actually have my own consulting business now, I replied, but he was already walking away to check on the football game. The first few hours of dinner preparation were typically awkward. Madison dominated the conversation with stories about her latest venture, a small catering business she'd started with money borrowed from our parents. She talked about her vision for expanding into event planning and possibly opening a restaurant someday. Madison has such an entrepreneurial spirit, Linda gushed while mashing potatoes. She gets that from your father's side of the family. All the business sense. I bit my tongue and continued chopping vegetables in silence. As we sat down for dinner, the conversation followed its usual pattern. Madison's business plans, Madison's dating life, Madison's exercise routine, Madison's friend drama. I was asked exactly 2 questions during the meal: whether I was still single, yes, and whether I was ever planning to move back to Ohio, no. The turning point came during dessert. Madison was talking about wanting to expand her catering business but needing investors. She'd already maxed out her credit cards and borrowed heavily from our parents, who were clearly stretched thin financially. It's just so frustrating, Madison said, waving her fork dramatically. I have all these amazing ideas, but I need capital to make them happen. If only I knew someone with money who believed in family. She looked directly at me when she said this, and I realized she was actually expecting me to offer to invest in her failing business. The audacity was breathtaking. Have you considered getting a business loan from a bank? I suggested mildly. Madison laughed dismissively. Banks don't understand creative vision. They just want boring financial projections and collateral. I need someone who gets it, who understands that sometimes you have to take risks to build something amazing. Speaking of taking risks, Robert interjected, Sarah, are you sure this computer consulting thing is stable? Seems like you're always switching jobs. Maybe you should think about something more reliable, like Madison's catering business. Food is something people always need. That comment stung more than usual, probably because I'd been financially stable for years while Madison had been hemorrhaging money on failed ventures. The irony was incredible. Actually, Dad, my consulting business is doing quite well, I said carefully. Well enough to help your sister with her expansion plans? Linda asked pointedly. Family should help family, Sarah. Madison would do the same for you if the situation were reversed. Would she, though? Madison had never helped me with anything in our entire lives. When I was struggling through college, she never once offered to share any of the generous allowance our parents gave her. When I was eating instant noodles for dinner every night, she was posting Instagram photos of expensive dinners with friends. I'm sure Sarah's doing fine, Madison said with false sweetness, but probably not help your sister start a restaurant fine. Right, Sarah? I mean, computer people make decent money, but it's not like you're rich or anything. Something about her tone hit me wrong. There was smugness there, an assumption that I was still the struggling, lesser daughter who needed to know her place in the family hierarchy. Actually, I said quietly, I'm doing better than decent. How much better? Madison pressed, her eyes lighting up with interest. Like, enough to invest in a proven business model with guaranteed returns? I should have deflected. I should have changed the subject or made an excuse to leave. But 32 years of being dismissed and underestimated by my family had built up like steam in a pressure cooker, and Madison's entitled expectation that I'd bankroll her latest failure was the final straw. Madison, I could buy your catering business 100 times over and not notice the money was gone. The table went quiet. Madison's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? She asked slowly. I mean I have enough money that I don't need to work anymore if I don't want to. I mean I could buy this house, your condo, and the house next door without breaking a sweat. Robert put down his beer. Sarah, what are you talking about? So I told them. I explained about Virtual Sphere, about being an early employee, about our breakthrough haptic technology, about the acquisition and the equity payout. I told them I'd made $15.2 million and had been financially independent for 4 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, pure rage. That's impossible, she said, her voice rising. You're lying. You live in some tiny apartment and work for startups. You don't even have a car. I live in a 4-bedroom house in Marin County with an ocean view, I replied calmly. And I have 3 cars, actually. I just don't see the point in driving them to Ohio for Thanksgiving dinner. Madison stood up so fast her chair tipped backward. You're lying. Show me your bank account. Show me proof. I pulled out my phone and opened my investment app, turning the screen toward her. The number at the top showed my current liquid assets, $19.4 million, grown from smart investments over the past 4 years. Madison stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before exploding. Are you kidding me? She screamed. You've had millions of dollars this whole time and never said anything? I've been struggling to build my business, asking for help, and you've been sitting on a fortune? Madison, calm down, Linda said weakly, but Madison was just getting started. Calm down? Calm down? My sister has been lying to us for years. She's been pretending to be poor while I've been working my ass off trying to make something of myself. Working your ass off? The words came out before I could stop them. Madison, you've never worked a day in your life. Every business you've started has been funded by mom and dad, and every one has failed within months. At least I try. At least I don't just hide behind a computer screen and get lucky. Lucky? I stood up now, years of resentment finally breaking free. I worked 16-hour days for 4 years building that company from nothing. I lived in a studio apartment the size of your walk-in closet and ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could save money. I earned every penny of that payout. And you never thought to help your family? We're your family, Sarah. Help my family with what, Madison? You mean give you money so you can start another business you'll abandon in 6 months? You mean bail mom and dad out of debt they created by funding your lifestyle for 30 years? Robert finally spoke up, his voice shaky. Sarah, is this real? Do you really have $15 million? Yes, Dad. And before you ask, no, I didn't tell you because I knew this would happen. I knew Madison would expect me to hand over money to fund whatever scheme she was working on, and I knew you'd support her. Madison's face was bright red now. You selfish bitch. Do you know how much mom and dad have sacrificed for us? Do you know how much they've struggled to help me get my businesses off the ground? They've sacrificed for you, Madison. They've never sacrificed anything for me. They didn't even come to my college graduation. Because you didn't invite us? Linda protested. I sent you 3 invitations. You said Madison's sorority formal was more important. The truth hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even Linda couldn't argue with that. Madison wasn't finished. She started pacing around the dining room, gesturing wildly. This explains everything. This is why you've been so smug and distant. You've been looking down on all of us, thinking you're better than us because you have money. I've been distant because you've never treated me like family. The only time any of you call me is when you need something, and even then, you don't really ask, you just assume I should be grateful to help. That's not true, Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. When was the last time any of you asked about my life? Not my job, not my money, but my actual life? My hopes, my dreams, my relationships? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? The silence answered my question. Madison stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes filled with tears of rage. You know what? I'm glad we ignored you. I'm glad we didn't waste time on someone who turned out to be such a cold, heartless person. What kind of sister watches her family struggle when she has the power to help? The kind of sister who was never really part of the family to begin with. That's when Madison completely lost it. She grabbed her wine glass and threw it at the wall behind me, red wine splashing across Linda's carefully chosen wallpaper. She started screaming about how I'd ruined Thanksgiving, how I was a terrible daughter, how I'd always been jealous of her. Madison, stop. Linda pleaded, but Madison was beyond reason. No. I'm done pretending she's family. She's a stranger. She's been lying to us for years, hoarding money while we struggled. You've never struggled a day in your life, I said coldly. Every struggle you've had has been cushioned by mom and dad's wallet. Madison picked up the serving dish of mashed potatoes and hurled it at me. I ducked, and it hit the china cabinet behind me, shattering 2 of Linda's grandmother's plates. Madison! Robert finally shouted, his face pale with shock. But Madison wasn't done. She grabbed the gravy boat next, then the cranberry sauce, throwing them wildly while screaming about betrayal and family loyalty. Linda was crying now, begging her to stop, but Madison was in full meltdown mode. You want to know what I think? Madison screamed, mascara running down her cheeks. I think you made all this up. I think you're still the same loser you've always been, and you're lying to make yourself feel important. I pulled out my phone again and showed her my investment portfolio, my bank accounts, my property records that I could access online. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Madison stared at the screen, her face crumpling as reality hit her. She wasn't the successful daughter. She wasn't the family star. She was the 30-year-old failure whose older sister had quietly become a millionaire while she was still asking her parents for rent money. She sank into her chair and started sobbing, not the pretty tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the ugly, hiccuping sobs of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. Robert was staring at his hands, probably calculating how much money they'd poured into Madison's ventures over the years. Linda was trying to comfort Madison while simultaneously cleaning up the food explosion. I stood up and grabbed my purse. "Where are you going?" Linda asked desperately. "Back to my hotel. Then back to California tomorrow morning." "Sarah, please," Robert said quietly. "We need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to move forward as a family." "Do we, Dad?" "Because for 32 years, I've been trying to be part of this family, and for 32 years, you've made it clear that I don't matter as much as Madison. Now that you know I have money, suddenly you want to talk?" He didn't have an answer for that. Madison looked up from her crying long enough to deliver one final blow. "If you leave now, don't ever come back. If you can't help your own family, then you're not our family." I paused at the doorway and turned back to look at them, Madison sobbing in her chair surrounded by food debris, Linda frantically trying to clean up the mess, and Robert sitting in stunned silence. "You're right, Madison. I'm not your family. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Family doesn't ignore someone for 32 years and then demand money when they find out she's successful." I walked out and drove straight to my hotel, my hands shaking with adrenaline and years of suppressed anger. The next morning, I flew back to San Francisco and immediately blocked all their phone numbers. I'd spent 3 decades hoping they'd change, hoping they'd see me as more than Madison's disappointing older sister. But some people never change, and some relationships can't be salvaged. Linda has been trying to reach me through Facebook messages, alternating between apologies and guilt trips about abandoning the family in their time of need. Madison created a fake Instagram account to send me messages calling me selfish and heartless. Robert hasn't tried to contact me at all, which honestly hurts more than Madison's tantrums. I've been seeing a therapist since I got back, working through 32 years of family dysfunction and learning to set healthy boundaries. She says what happened at Thanksgiving was inevitable, that I'd been carrying around all that pain and rejection for so long that it was bound to explode eventually. The money didn't ruin my relationship with my family. It just revealed how broken that relationship already was. I'm not sorry I told them. I'm not sorry Madison had a meltdown. I'm not sorry they finally had to confront the reality of how they treated me all these years. What I'm sorry about is that I wasted so much time hoping they'd change. Now I'm focusing on building real relationships with people who value me for who I am, not what I can do for them. I'm dating someone wonderful who knew me before he knew about my money, and I've got a close circle of friends who've become my chosen family. Sometimes I wonder if Madison ever got her catering business off the ground, or if my parents are struggling financially without my potential bailout. But then I remind myself that their problems aren't mine to solve, especially when they spent 3 decades making it clear that I wasn't really part of their family anyway. The best revenge isn't always elaborate schemes or public humiliation. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and refusing to let toxic people drag you back into their dysfunction. I'm finally free, and I've never been happier. Madison was right about one thing, though, I'm not their family anymore. And that's the best thing that ever happened to me.